Good morning, everybody. I'm Paul Salem, Senior Vice President for Policy Research and Programs here at the Middle East Institute. Very pleased to welcome you today to this event on Tunisia, the domestic politics there, the upcoming municipal elections currently set for May 6. A total of 2,173 lists of candidates will be vying for 7,287 seats in 350 municipalities. These elections, the local ones, are the first since the 2011 revolution, the first since the terror attacks of 2015, seen as a hope for Tunisia's democratic transition if everything goes well. They will be followed by parliamentary and presidential elections next year in 2019. Interestingly, over 75% of registrants of candidates under the age of 45, 50% under 35, a very high number. Women candidates make up 47.5% of the field. More than 1,800 candidates with special needs. The election law stipulates that there must be one candidate with a physical disability among the first 10 candidates on each list. So very interesting dynamics there. What is the significance of these upcoming local elections? How do they relate to the wider political transition? What's the significance and impact of the large-scale participation of youth and women? What's the impact of municipalities in general in social and economic development? How do we understand this wider process? With me to discuss these and other related issues, we have an expert panel. I'm very honored to welcome to the Middle East Institute Ambassador Fayçal Gouia. Ambassador, welcome to MEI, the Ambassador of Tunisia to the United States, a long-time high-ranking member of Tunisia's Foreign Service, was appointed Ambassador to the U.S. in 2015, has served in several posts in Tunisia, including at the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Also with us today is dear friend Elie Abouaoun, Director of the Middle East and North Africa Programs at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Welcome, Elie.
Thank you.
Prior to joining USIP, he held the position of Executive Director at the Arab Human Rights Fund. Previous positions also included positions with the Danish Refugee Council in Iraq, Program Coordinator for Ockenden International, also in Iraq, and Director of External Relations for the Lebanese NGO Arc-en-Ciel. Finally, very pleased to welcome Dr. Sabine Henenberg, an expert on transitional governments currently working next door at Johns Hopkins School of Advanced and International Studies. Welcome, Sabine. Her work focuses on understanding how pre-existing conditions and agents' choices shaped the first interim governments in Tunisia and Libya following the uprisings, currently continuing research and publishing on issues relating to political transitions in North Africa. This session is being recorded both audio and video for posting on the MEI website and tweeting out later, so that we ask that you silence your cell phones, please, but keep them on because we do encourage tweeting. On the event, you can use hashtag MEITunisia. Before we begin, I also want to call your attention to MEI's expansion campaign, our largest ever fundraising effort. We are renovating and expanding our traditional home around the corner on N Street so as to accommodate MEI's rapidly growing activities, including a new art gallery, which will feature work of Middle Eastern artists. Please pick up a pledge card at the front desk on your way out today and consider giving, if you can, to support MEI's work. Again, thank you for coming, and let's begin the conversation. Let me start first with you, Ambassador Gouia. How would you situate these local elections in the context of Tunisia's political dynamics, transition, and challenges? Where would you start explaining the significance of these municipal elections?
First of all, thank you very much for organizing this panel on Tunisia and the current situation and the perspectives of the situation in Tunisia in the light of the next municipal elections. Thank you very much for joining us for this event. How can I situate the municipal election within the dynamic, the political dynamic of Tunisia since the revolution 2011. This is one piece of the new dynamics that happened in Tunisia during the last 7 years. As you mentioned, and you have the statistics that I don't have right now with me, but thank you for giving all these numbers and figures, because they explain how much the process is first large, integrated, sometimes how much it's complex. And I will tell you about all these elements, but let me put the elections in their political context in Tunisia. As I said, it's another milestone in the long way of political change in Tunisia. The democratic transition in Tunisia started right after the revolution, but one element was missing, which is the local and municipal transition. We made all kind of other reforms and transitions, especially the one on the parliamentarian level, the presidential, putting together institutions. Some are already there and they are doing their job. Some others are in the process, such as the constitutional court, or the Supreme Court, the equivalent of the Supreme Court here in the US. So it's a dynamic. But as local and municipal elections, these are the first. Why it took us 7 years to organize local elections? It is not because for us it's not considered as a priority. It is a priority. And you cannot talk about democratization of the country without talking of local governance. It is essential to decentralize, to give power to people, to exercise their rights in terms of determining their future and the future of their regions and communities and localities.
Could you tell us a bit about the decentralization structure? How empowered will these municipalities be? Where does their money come from? Are they really local and autonomous, or does the central government have a big influence over them after they're elected?
I'll answer to the second part of the question because it's very important. These elections, maybe they are happening before the adoption of the local and municipal law. How can this happen? Sometimes democracy has some prerequisites and has some constraints, and we have to respect the views of and the opinions and the interaction between all the political forces in the country. It takes time. And the experience during the last 7 years showed that you cannot implement or adopt or negotiate a law or without consulting, because in the final step, when it comes to the parliament, which is composed of so many different political parties and political orientations, you have to at least have some consensus prior to getting to the
So currently the elections are taking place, but without the full revision.
We expect, yes.
So if they're elected, what powers will they have before a new law takes place?
There are two different things here. You have the electoral code, which is there, and on the basis of what we are
holding elections.
Yes, we are organizing the election, and there is the law that organize the work of the municipals and the regional and local councils. So for the organization of the elections, we have no problem because the law is there. There are some promises from the parliament because the law exists in the parliament, and they are still discussing the law at the different commissions before it gets to the plenary. And there are promises from the parliament that the law maybe will pass before the election or slightly after the election, but it will not influence the election. How about the financing of all this process? There are three ways. First, the government. Of course, it will inject, and it used to be the same, the case in the future. The government and the budget inject,
would allocate for municipalities.
Yes, to the municipalities funds. Second, the municipalities have their own revenues coming from local taxations, etc., properties and renting, some
commercial
activities, etc. Third, a big part of funding these municipality councils comes from PPP, the private-public partnership. It is a new concept. The law exists already, but it will be implemented, and implemented not on the central level, but this time it will be implemented on the local and regional level, which is another reform within the big reform of the financing and funding of the
Is there any other levels in between the central government and these 350 municipalities?
Yes.
Are there regions, governorates, and if so, how much authority do they have in the process of decentralization or not?
You talked about the process, and it's a real process. We are not talking about democratization is not
overnight.
An instant, overnight decision or an instant coffee. It's a process. It takes time. We expect this reform, the reform of the local and municipal activities for the next 10 to 15 years. It's a long process because it is also related to the decentralization. Systems in our region, I'm not talking only about Tunisia, but in the region we inherited the French system, and it's based on the center. Everything is related to the center, and you have to get back to the center for any decision related to finance of the localities or for the big decisions related to the future projects. Now, the process will start from the day of the election to the end of the reforms by first putting together the programs and projects that are not decided, nationally, but by every and each localities and each municipality and regional council, and then all these programs, of course, should not be approved, but should get to the center for the government, or the government for the government, of course, to include all these elements decided regionally in what we call our development plan.
National plan.
National plan. We have a national plan, 5 years national plan, and it includes all the programs that are related to the country as a whole, but to each and every region. And these programs and projects locally decided will be included in the development plan, which is conceived by the government.
Central government. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Let me turn to Elie. Could you tell us a bit about this high level of young people's participation, women's participation? USIP works with a lot of these groups in Tunisia. How do you interpret that? Is it partly because there's frustration at the national level, they're going to the local level, or it's just part of a natural higher level of engagement? How do you examine it all?
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for having us on this panel. Yeah, I mean, the U.S. Institute of Peace has several programs in Tunisia. So for those who don't know, I personally live there, and I'm just visiting Washington, D.C. right now. So going back to the question, I think the answer is multi-layered. You can still feel a strong desire in the different segments of the Tunisian society to participate in the public life in different forms, whether through civil society, through other initiatives. And more recently, we noticed this desire to participate through the upcoming municipal elections. So this is one thing. But at the same time, one cannot deny that there is a very high level of frustration at the grassroots level. And the frustration is caused by several factors. But I think the main factor, the main driver of this frustration is the fact that in Tunisia, we did not see yet a sustained economic growth, which would allow some sort of prosperity at different levels. Now, looking at the reasons why there is no economic growth, I'm not an economic expert, but there are experts who are talking about the slow implementation of economic reforms, the regional conflicts, etc. However, from our perspective, we see that this frustration is going to be, if it's left unaddressed, it's going to have serious consequences. And this is where we are calling not only the government, but all the other actors, because I think the opposition parties, the social actors, everyone has a role to play, the international community, everyone has a role to play to help addressing these tensions. One thing that needs to be done, from our perspective at least, is to unpack the expectations of the population, which in most of the cases are unrealistic expectations, given the context in Tunisia, and try to address this through strategic communications, through a consensus-building process at the grassroots level. So all these processes are absent right now, and I think the government needs to think seriously about not only building a consensus at the top level, which is between the parties forming the coalition government and the national level social actors, but also at the grassroots level.
And in terms of the groups that are the young people and the women, the women's movement as a movement had a big role in the uprising and the transition as a sort of quite a militant feminist and women's movement. Is the high level of participation of women in terms of candidacy part of the movement or just a natural empowerment of women acting on their own initiative? Is it?
I mean, I don't see this as strange to Tunisia. Tunisia's gender movement has always been quite strong and in all cases stronger than many other neighboring countries. So I don't have specific insights on this, but personally I don't see it as something strange to the Tunisian norms in general.
Let me ask you also of the politics of it. I mean, there's the parties in the coalition, there's other parties, some in parliament, some not. I think about half of the lists are party lists, but then there's other lists that are not, sort of independents and so on. Could you explain a bit the politics of getting to the municipal elections, maybe differences over the decentralization law, which parties are favoring it, which parties are afraid of the results that might happen? How does it play out politically?
I think given the fact that everyone is waiting for the decentralization law to be adopted and implemented, all the actors, whether political or social actors, are looking at these elections as an important opportunity to be positioned on the political map later on. And therefore, I mean, personally, I noticed there is a great interest by most of these actors to make sure that they have appropriate candidates, that they get a significant number of seats on the different municipal councils. So, yeah, I think the main driver is the fact that everyone is looking at the municipalities post-decentralization law, not the current status and authority of the municipality.
And I think Nida Tunis and Al-Nahda have fielded lists in all 350 That's what I've been.
Well, obviously, they are the two biggest parties. Yeah,
and they're fairly equal in their power. Is the election law proportional, or in other words, will one list take all the seats in a municipality, or will the results be proportional or mixed results in each municipality?
I leave it up
proportional.
To the,
It's proportional, so there will be mixed results.
Yes, yes. It's not on the list, but on the best results for each list.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, and it will be, by the end, it will be...
so municipalities will have probably more than one party.
Exactly, and why we choose this more difficult way it is more difficult than
straight,
to, yes, the straight way to have elections. Saad Safir, Sabah al-Khair. It is because we are really engaged and committed to translate our engagement in democracy in a deep
at all levels.
Way and at all levels, and having also a debate within and different views and opinions and orientations within the municipal councils is another proof that we are going very deep in trying to democratize our society and our community.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Sabina, let me turn to you. You studied both Tunisia and Libya, but you also look at these transitions in a broader sort of political science transition context. Tunisia was sort of the only glimmer of good news from the Arab Spring that went in very bad directions in other countries. How do you see the municipal elections in Tunisia as part of Tunisia's transition? How is it going? Will it reinforce that process? What's your assessment?
Well, also, thanks for having me. One thing I think is important to ask about what these elections can achieve is how much they can sort of transfer power, balance power between elites and Tunisians. The recent demonstrations and numerous other events since 2011 have pointed to the ways that despite being sparked by sort of the Tunisian population, this has been a very elite-led transition. So one thing I think is interesting to think about are some of the ways that this attempt at introducing a democratic political system is different from Tunisia's attempt in 1987 when Ben Ali took over, which also promised democratic reform and inspired hope in a lot of people, but was quickly taken away. So I would point to a couple features of this transition that we might look to think about what the role of these elections could be. First, so in this transition, I would argue there has been more of a role for moderate elites or people who have helped balance between opposing views. That has been more present at some point since 2011 than others. Second, as everyone knows, the role of civil society has been extremely important in this process, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that. We've already begun to in terms of these elections. Civil society wasn't absent in the late 1980s, but I would argue it's been more robust. It's more robust in Tunisia now. And then the third argument that was put forth in the late 1980s was that the system was becoming more inclusive and consensus-based, and that the processes were consensus-based. And those words have been used again in this transition, and I think it's kind of ambiguous whether or not there's a genuine consensus now over what this new political system should look like. And so that would be an important question to ask about these upcoming elections.
And do you think these upcoming elections in bringing partly young people but local elites into an organized democratic political system, one expects that would reinforce and give a broader base for this democratic transition so that it moves away from the elite sort of led aspect that you indicated. Is there anything potentially destabilizing about this, or do you see it as all positive, as it were?
Yeah, in a very general sense, I guess the opportunities that decentralization and local elections bring are about bringing democracy and decision-making closer to the people. But the risks are that flaws in the system, corruption and patronage, get replicated at the local level. I would say in Tunisia there are both sources of optimism for genuine democratic processes to be introduced at the local level thanks to these processes and these elections, partly by looking to some of the adaptation and kind of learning about what it takes to build a genuine democratic system, which is an ongoing process. But there's been evidence of learning about that since 2011, I would say. At the same time, Dr. Abouaoun in particular mentioned that it's very unclear whether the timing of these elections is conducive to really allowing that to go forward, just because on the one hand, it's probably good they're not delayed again, and there is quite a bit of enthusiasm around them, is my understanding, but there's also a lot of frustration and sort of disillusionment with the processes.
Thank you. Ambassador Gouia, tell us a little bit about the security situation, which was a big concern, obviously, in 2015. It's been better in recent years. Is there any threat to the local elections? But more broadly, how is Tunisia dealing with its security issues? There have been some complaints that maybe the crackdowns are too harsh. Is that narrative moving forward?
When we talk about successes in Tunisia, we talk about success on security. Now, for the last 2 years, and thank God, touche le bois, comme on dit, there are no major attacks. But talking about, and I've heard this recently somewhere, talking about zero risk anywhere in the world, not only in Tunisia, is being very, very optimistic. Our security forces, our military forces are very, very vigilant. Now we acquired the technology, the training, the equipment that allowed us to tackle terrorist attacks and to tackle any kind of attacks on our people, on our visitors, because remember that those attacks targeted mainly tourists, and the objective is clear. It's for these obscurantists, forces to hit very badly one of the pillars of the Tunisian economy, which is tourism. But hopefully they were not successful. The tourism sector is back to normal activities. And last year, we came back to the same numbers of the tourist arrivals to Tunisia than previous to the to the revolution. And the expectation for this year is even higher. We expect more than 8 million tourists to arrive to Tunisia during this year. So back to the question on security, we made so many successes. The readiness of our forces is quite high. I would like to thank here the United States for the close cooperation and the close support we had from America during the last few years. And this cooperation is continuing. In less than a couple of months, we're going to have our GMC, Joint Military Commission, in Tunis. And it is very important for our two military institutions to come together and discuss the security situation in Tunisia. And it's related to U.S. security, partly, of course. It is essential for us, but it's partly important also for the United States. because the security of Tunisia and security of the region is important for Tunisia and the region, but also is important for the United States, for its interests in the region and in the world.
Sure, sure. On economics, Tunisia is attempting to do structural reforms while also having a democratic transition.
Right.
You look at sort of in Egypt, attempts at economic structural reform with a closing down of political space, sort of a different trajectory. What are the challenges in implementing structural reform for the central government while at the same time needing to satisfy a population which can vote and which is empowered?
I would like to tell the audience here, but everyone, and this is part of my speech here and the message I would like to vehiculate here in Washington. Tunisia is tackling not only the security and democratization and reforms. Tunisia is tackling everything yeah. At the same time within an ecosystem which is not favorable. So give us the time. We are not asking more than giving Tunisia some time, some space to work on all these areas at the same time with all the challenges and the difficulties and the شح الموارد. I like this
lack
word
of
in Arabic.
resources or
very bad lack of resources. I like it in Arabic.
It sounds bad. Yeah.
It's strong.
Scarcity.
You look for resources and you can't find them, and you have so many challenges. So give us time. This government is very serious about reforming, all sectors at the same time altogether. But you have many in Tunisia. It's very particular, and you can compare Tunisia to any other democratic regime or country. Decisions now in Tunisia are not taken, by one man in 1 minute in one place, the palace or whatever. Now, to make a decision or to take a decision or to decide for any reform, you have to consult with hundreds of partners, the labor, the parliament, the civil society, the different political parties, etc., etc., etc. Look at the constitution. How much time we took to put together and to draft the constitution. It took us almost 5 years. Why? Because consultation went through all stakeholders. And any decision, sometimes any paragraph, sometimes one word. When we decided to include the liberty of conscience, which is a new concept, maybe you cannot find this in many
Arab
constitutions,
yeah.
not Arab, ever constitutions in the world. It was not easy. We had a debate for 2 years about these two words. So this is, I'm not asking for any favor for Tunisia. If we have to criticize Tunisia on some areas where things are not working, that's democracy.
It's normal.
It's
yeah.
normal. But if we put more pressure on Tunisia, knowing very well that Tunisia is facing all these challenges locally, internally, and externally, and not giving any favor or any space for Tunisia to advance and to make path on its very difficult and bumpy way to democracy, this is asking Tunisia too much.
Too much, yeah.
Some other countries, I don't want to mention any country, have more difficulties, have more obstacles towards democracy. Tunisia is crossing its way. Surely, maybe, slowly but surely towards democracy. It will take time. Don't forget that for some democracies, back in the 90s and even the 80s, the 18th century and 19th century, it took them 96 years for some countries. It took some other countries 48 years. For other countries, it took them about 70 it took them some time, like 67 years to achieve a democracy. 7 years in the life and the history of a nation is too short.
It's very short.
It's
Absolutely.
very short. With all the difficulties we have. Some other democracies, they found some support. Let me give some examples. When Spain and Portugal and started their process after the dictatorship they knew with their former leaders, they found
partners and supporting environments.
Partners. Yeah. Greece lately, when they had some difficulties and they were about to get into bankruptcy, they found the European Union. Tunisia is crossing its way solely, alone. Of course, I should not deny the very strong partnership and assistance of some great strategic partner, such as the United States, but we rely on ourselves, and we are happy and proud to rely on ourselves, and we are happy also to rely partly on our partners. And thank you, the United States, for the strong support, not only financially, but mainly politically. It's a strong support. We recognize to the United States its support to Tunisia in this very difficult time in its long history.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. Dr. Abouaoun, going back to the economic policies and conditions, still unemployment levels are high, there's strains. What policies do you see the government needs to prioritize? It can't do everything at once, as the ambassador was saying. How do you break that down in terms of making life easier for citizens?
Yeah. Before getting into this, if you allow me to make a very short statement about the security situation. So as His Excellency mentioned, the security situation is much better. The capacities of the security institutions is much higher. And I think one of the reasons why we're seeing this level of safety in Tunisia is the fact that there is a closer relationship between the security forces and the communities. And there are several organizations in Tunisia, including the U.S. Institute of Peace, working on initiatives or projects with the aim of bridging the gap between the security forces or the security institutions and the communities. And this is working well. I think this is one of the reasons why we're seeing, in addition to the train and equip programs and other programs that are equally important. But I wanted to highlight the importance of bridging this gap that existed post-2011. So back to the question, I think, so let me put forward one statement to make sure that my opinion will not be misinterpreted. I think that the Tunisian government has a lot to do to boost or to make sure that the reforms are happening in a timely manner and to boost the growth. But at the same time, I'd like to highlight the fact that addressing a crisis of this scope requires the collaboration of many actors. And here I'd like to mention the fact that the unions in particular are not playing the constructive role they should be playing to support the government. And one of the reasons could be that the perception of their role, the self-perception of their role is definitely oversized. I don't think they are conscious that their role is to be a labor union, a social actor, and not to infringe on the political realm. At the same time, there is a kind of withdrawal or a weak contribution by the private sector. Under the excuse of the banking regulations and the legislation in general is not conducive to us to conduct business. So a lot of private sector entities are now investing outside of Tunisia. And there's the role of the government. And I mentioned before where I see some flaws in what the government is doing, mostly at the level of the strategic communication and at the level of consensus building at the grassroots level. One last thing is, I think, is really counterproductive is the attempt by many actors, whether the government or the other actors, to overpromise what a single party or even a single coalition can deliver in this context in Tunisia. And I think this is being used as the escape strategy, as the exit strategy by the government and by the unions. They are resorting to a populist discourse that is counterproductive, that is, if it's doing anything, it's only fueling the tension and raising the expectations instead of checking them out.
So sort of a game of expectations. And I wanted to ask you a bit, going back to security. Tunisia has had a high number of jihadists involved in other groups in the region. And there are parts of Tunisia that have been hotbeds of radicalism. What is that situation now? Which parts of Tunisia? Is that a problem in the local elections? Are they running in some cases, allied with some groups? What can you describe about that situation?
Radicalization in Tunisia is similar to many places in the region. It's not limited to ISIS or Islamist or... So yes, there are radical movements in Tunisia, and some of them are quite secular. I always say that...
Good point.
I always say that the radical secular groups could be as toxic as the other groups. So yes, there are radical elements running for election, but I don't see them only coming from one background. I see them coming from different backgrounds. And I really hope that some civil society organizations will be able to neutralize the effect of these radical elements, because some of them will make it to the municipal council. There's no doubt that some of them will make it. Now, how much this radical discourse will translate into violence, I see major obstacles to this. I don't see Tunisia right now prone to fall into cycles of violence as easy as some analysts are describing. I think there are many impediments to the radical discourse leading to actual violence on the ground, except topical violence, like here and there, very contextual, in the aftermath of the protest, or I don't know, the police forces in a given locality overreact to a situation. But other than this, I don't see a wider form of violence in Tunisia happening after the election.
Thank you, Elie. Sabina, these local elections will be followed next year by parliamentary and presidential elections. There is a debate about the parliamentary election law. Those are very important, milestones next year in the transition as well. What are your thoughts about those challenges looking to 2019?
I guess I would answer very big picture or broadly again. First, it depends on how much of a sort of success and boost other parties besides the two main parties that have been sort of dominating the political scene over the last several years get from these elections, and what kind of new dynamics that can introduce. And then that would be at the elite level or political level, and at the societal level, the same question. How encouraged are people by this opportunity to exercise their voice in the new democratic system, and or participate as youth candidates, things like that. So the outcome of these elections in terms of the positive model that it can build would be things to look to for the 2019
and could you tell us a bit about the debate over the election law? Do you been following that on parliamentary elections? Maybe I can ask the ambassador, but let me ask you as well, what can the international community do to help along this transition? What has it done? What has it done well? What has it not done well? Tunisia being this sort of specific positive case.
Yeah, I would be interested to hear what the other panelists have to say too. My perspective is that the role of the international community in Tunisia, unlike in other countries, has been largely constructive until now. And it's important because I think it's important to Tunisians that the international community offers its support in this very difficult time. At the same time, this is a Tunisian process, and so I guess my assessment overall that the international community's role has been constructive comes from so far having struck a good balance between not interfering too much in what should be a Tunisian-led thing and providing sufficient support to different aspects of the process until now.
Well, maybe I'll ask the ambassador sort of the same question. You've certainly talked about the U.S. and the U.S. role.
Right.
The Europeans are obviously important partners. Could you tell us a bit about what engagement they've had economically and politically? And if you would also comment, in many other parts of the Arab world, one's neighbors are difficult. You have Libya, obviously, on one side, which is very difficult in its own case, but Algeria and Morocco. Could you say a bit about the regional context as well for Tunisia?
Well, Tunisia was really under the scopes of the international community. And some were looking at Tunisia as a hope for the region. Some others are looking at Tunisia as an example. Some others are looking at Tunisia as a country that should not give the best of its new image for their regimes to keep the status quo. So there are many. There is no one political line that is conducing all these process. But in general, we received very positive echo and support from the international community. Now, and your question is related to politically and economically. Politically, I think grossly the political support is very important. From the US, from the European Union you mentioned, from many other partners and friendly countries. Economically, that's a question. We are facing our destiny by ourselves. And it's natural, normal in this very liberal world economic environment. Now, I don't know any big country that has the means and the power, financial power, to come and tell its investors, no, go to Tunisia and invest. It's up to the business community to decide. Yeah, the market forces to decide. And when they can decide to come to Tunisia or not, when all the conditions are there to welcome them and to welcome their business and to prepare them to make profit. Are these conditions met now in Tunisia? That's the question. And that's what the government is trying to do every day. And we were talking about the reforms. Mainly the reforms are targeting the economic side. The banking system, the fiscal system, the customs system. We have to reform all these. Some of the reforms are already done. Some others are in the way to be also done. But it's a process, as I said, and it takes time. So we should rely on ourselves. This is very important. We have to arrange our problems and our challenges by ourselves. Of course, our partners are essential, are important in continuing to support the Tunisian process politically and, if possible, economically. I would like to maybe get back to what my friend Elie said about radicals, being involved in the elections. I have a question for, what do you mean by radicals? I mean, as far as I know, in Tunisia, we have either, seculars or politicians or groups or political parties that have, some religious references, and it exists not only in Tunisia but all over the world, like the Christians, Democrats, and so many other examples. Do you mean that parties or individuals, and there are independent lists on the figures you gave, you consider them as radicals, or you consider them as parties that are playing the democratic rules, and they are even involved in the government, and they are part of the political ecosystem in the country.
Elie?
Great. I always expect some movement when I talk about radicalization. I may have my own definition, but for someone who is coming, I come myself from the region. I lived over there. I lived the civil war in Lebanon. I witnessed the political changes in the region since in the last 20 years at least. So my definition of radical, first of all, I talked about radical elements. I did not accuse entire parties of being radical or not radical. I was talking about elements, and I think radical elements exist in all parties, not only in Tunisia, but in most of the region. I think there is a widespread culture of radicalization in the region that is not specific to Tunisia. And the way I define it is that every time we find someone denying the right of another person or another entity to be part of the political process, I personally call it radicalization. Many people might disagree with this definition, but I was, just to right-size my statement, I was talking about my own definition of radicalization, which is political exclusion. And I can clearly see within Tunisia and beyond in the region, a lot of radical elements being in parties, in different parties, whether secular or Islamist.
Does that help you, Mr. Ambassador? Leave it be. Leave it be. It's a long debate.
It's a long debate. I don't want to.
I'm going to ask one more question and then turn to the audience. Let me ask you, Elie, or if the ambassador also.
Yes.
On next year, I mean, I asked Sabina as well, next year parliamentary elections, presidential elections. What do you see coming down the road? I'll start with you, Elie, on the election law for parliament. President, the presidency is a key position. Any thoughts about that?
Well, I mean, it's very hard to predict, but what I hope is the adoption and the implementation of the decentralization law. I think it's going to be another key milestone after the municipal election. So I do hope that the pre-presidential election dynamics will not slow down or impede the adoption of the decentralization law.
Okay, Mr. Ambassador, any thoughts on next year?
Let's focus on the municipal and the
Get
regional.
that done first.
But yes. But of course, the whole country, all parties, Tunisians, the civil society, the entire country, of course, is now preparing for the general elections next year. It is an important political rendezvous. All Tunisians will be in the rendezvous. Political parties, of course, now are making some calculations for the upcoming elections, but they are eyeing the general elections because it will be maybe a signal, and they are very keen, very keen to succeed this upcoming election. And as I said, they eye the next election.
The general one.
What's going to happen next year? We will have an interesting debate among all parties and among all media and international observers and civil society. So it will be a big debate. But it will be, this is my own opinion, it will be very healthy for a country like Tunisia in the very first steps of its democratization to have such a debate. It is healthy because we understand and we know and we evaluate, the process. We evaluate the results and we project also for the next years. And it will be also important, maybe in my own sense, once again, to see if there will be new political figures
emerging
from these elections, because the Tunisian people experienced, some politicians and some governments, and maybe in the next elections there will be the emerging of some figures, not a lot, but some new figures, political figures, maybe from younger generations, and it is also very healthy for the political process.
Something to watch. Thank you. Let's turn to the audience for audience questions. Bill right there, second. Introduce yourself and pose your question or remark.
Bill Lawrence, George Washington University. So one question for Elie and Sabina, drilling down on the youth enthusiasm. On the one hand, we have large numbers of youth candidates. On the other hand, we have a history of very youth vote participation. And then we have this interesting phenomenon of a lot of these youth running as independents, not in political parties, but then I just heard Nehedad opened up their list to youth independents. And so I'm imagining scenarios here of, you know, large youth turnouts for candidates that don't do anything because they're not in parties, or low youth turnouts, and then a continuing of this frustration. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the youth element in the vote. And my second question for the ambassador, Libya's talking about holding elections, which they probably shouldn't for reasons that you raised. Libya, there's a large Libyan community in Tunisia. Tunisia's done a lot for the Libyans. And yet I was very surprised at events, some which you attended this year, hearing Tunisian parliamentarians talk about little discussion about Libya. I know that the president was having weekly meetings at one point. But for example, the Libyans have a lot to learn from the Tunisian constitutional process, but there's very little dialogue there. So what more can Tunisia do to help stabilize Libya, which then helps stabilize Tunisia? You know, what is your thinking about the whole Libyan piece of what's going on?
Thank you, but let's take a couple more questions, Mr. Ambassador. Yeah, if you want to write down, you have your.
Thank you, Paul.
Whoops.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Ambassador Fayçal, for your presentation. I missed a great deal of your presentation due to some traffic outside. But anyhow, we are in the Arab League very proud of Tunisia. We regard Tunisia as an iconic example in comparison to the other Arab members in the Arab League. Regarding this upcoming municipal election, I'm wondering if you need to invite any international institution or maybe Arab institution like Arab League to monitor this election, or there's no need for that. And you have touched about security issues, very important. You are bordering Libya, and I think you are keeping an eye on that border, how to keep Tunisia safe in that processing. So would you please let us what you think about that? Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. The gentleman in the fourth row. Then we'll go to the panel and have another round.
I'm Yarmed Ahmed from the Minaret of Freedom Institute. My question is for Elie Abouaoun. Regarding your definition of a radical as someone who would exclude someone else from the election, if someone accepts that definition of radical and wants to exclude radicals from the election, does that make them a radical?
It's becoming a thought exercise. I'll take one more question for this round. Gentleman in the front row.
Thank you very much. Michael Kurtzig, who worked on agriculture and economics in North Africa. Paul, the first comments that you made was the very young population in this country. You have a young population in Tunisia, in Egypt, in Saudi Arabia. They don't have jobs. I think PBS yesterday said after what I call a sham election in Egypt, 80% of the young people are unemployed. Where are the jobs coming from Tunisia? And I asked that question because people who don't have jobs begin to become extreme and begin to take such actions. So do you have any idea from the economy, maybe you do, where the jobs are coming from? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Let's go to the panel, go this way. Elie, start with you.
Great. So on the question about youth, I think that, as I mentioned, we see a great enthusiasm specifically by youth to take part in the election. Now, how much this enthusiasm will translate into actual turnout on the election day, I don't know. It's very hard. I mean, at least for me. For us, we're not an agency specialized in election. So I'm just conveying our own observations on our interaction with the youth. But we don't study this specifically as a U.S. Institute of Peace. But we definitely see now a very high level of enthusiasm to be part of this. And I think the fact that many are running as independent candidates has to do, partly to do, with the disillusion with the political parties. There is somehow a disappointment by the traditional political parties. On the radicals, I would never promote excluding anyone, any human being, from being part of a political process, except if they are using violence. So for nonviolent radicals, and they do exist in the region, I may have a political problem. I don't like this. I think that this is dangerous, but I wouldn't go as far as banning them from public participation in general.
There you go. Good news.
Bill, what Tunisia can do, yes, for Libya. You answered part of the question, and you said you did a lot for Libyans, especially right after the revolution. We opened our doors, and our doors are still open to Libyans. And right now, we have more than 500,000 Libyans living in Tunisia for many reasons. Security, economic, social, just name it, reasons. They live in Tunisia without any restrictions, without, a visa requirement, so they are considered as part of our communities, etc. And we are proud to do that for humanitarian reasons, for a good neighboring, climate and atmosphere in the region, because the region is under very strong pressure, and also for the perspective in the future. In the collective memory of Libyans, Tunisia was there and was a friend when Libya is going through a difficult time. The initiative by President Beji Qaid Sibsi, sorry, to include the immediate neighboring countries, mainly Egypt and Algeria, with Tunisia, we have an initiative, and it's working very well. And it's working in full respect of the UN process, and but it's also giving some solutions for Libyans. We are not imposing any measure or any giving any instructions, but we try to help. And so far, this initiative is very successful. We are one. It is one initiative among so many others, but I think our initiative is oriented directly to the Libyans, and Libyans are very happy. Sorry, with this initiative. What we can do, not much, because we think that the solution is within Libya, between Libyans, and all what the international community should do is to help Libyans to organize and to learn to live together, and to organize themselves and and structure their society and structure their political life in a way that allows them to avoid conflicts and avoid disagreement. Libya has all the ingredients to be really the Dubai, if you want, or the Singapore of the region. It's a very wealthy country, a huge country, beautiful country, nice people, a lot of wealth. What misses is some, national dialogue, maybe like Tunisia did in 2 years or 3 years ago, and we were awarded for that the Nobel Peace Prize. Maybe Libyans should follow our steps on that area, and maybe also get inspired from the Tunisian experience. And you mentioned the constitution, that's very important. But in my own opinion, the first thing to do in Libya now is to have a national army or Republican army, first to save the country, and second to handle all the problems and the crisis in Libya. And then the political process should start very, very soon. Some here mentioned the elections, etc. So it is maybe a second step. Last question regarding unemployment. Unemployment is a real problem in so many developing countries. If you look at the pyramid of ages in our societies, in Tunisia, about 65% of Tunisians are youth, are under 35 years. And the peak, of this pyramid is right now. And we have to provide thousands and hundreds of thousands of young people. So many among them are university, have university degrees with jobs. The job market in Tunisia is relatively small. We don't have enough FDIs, foreign direct investments, that helps, the economy to absorb all these numbers of young people asking for jobs. And also some sectors should develop or should, offer more jobs, such as tourism, such as manufacturing, etc. Farming, also agriculture, is very important to absorb part of the population, but it is a real problem. I think right after security, the problem of unemployment is, for me and for the government, is number 2 major problem in the country that we should address. Otherwise, as many of us here said, youth will not be happy, will not be satisfied, will not see democracy and look at democracy as delivering, and everybody in Tunisia is waiting for deliverables.
The answer question of the observers from the Arab
observers,
League.
you are welcome, Mr. Ambassador. I will send you an invitation to observe now, but more seriously, I know he loves Tunisia. He wants to go to Tunisia. Yes. Sorry?
Borders, the issue of borders with Libya.
I didn't listen to that question, sorry. We have, with the United States, once again, a very candid and important project to install an electronic fence. And the...
Will it be paid for by Libya?
Sorry? I'm laughing.
Will the Libyans pay for it? I mean, it's a joke about... Ignore that comment.
I'm not going to comment. As a good diplomat.
Egypt.
No, but it's very important to mention, thank you very much, thanks to the close cooperation with the United States and Germany, we are now in the process of installing an electronic fence, yes, to avoid especially smuggling and trafficking, and I think it's a good decision.
Thank you. Sabina, any comments on youth? But also I wanted to ask you, since your research was on Libya and Tunisia and their transition, any comments about how Libyans might learn from the Tunisian example, or is it absolutely so different?
Okay, well, thanks for the question about youth. I agree. Youth is a key actor to watch. And I sort of think about youth in Tunisia, probably elsewhere, but exhibiting similar features to the media, broadly speaking, in Tunisia, in that there's a lot of enthusiasm and a lot of hope, and also a lot of inexperience demonstrated, and maybe that's to be expected. So I would underscore, I think, the importance of what was mentioned, which is the strategic communication on the part of the government, in addition to jobs, of course, being key, looking forward to what the youth can offer.
Mm-hmm. On the Libya, Tunisia, any comparisons there that are useful?
Yeah, as someone who's tried to study Tunisia and Libya in a comparative framework, I think it's a tricky thing to do. Two things we could consider as dimensions of transition that might be important to look to, broadly speaking, would be, on the one hand, social cohesion, or a shared understanding of the political community that's being built, and on the other hand, inclusive institutions at the political level to encompass what the society as it transforms. I wouldn't say either one of those elements is clearly present in Tunisia yet, but they're probably both, if we think of them as a continuum, more fully developed than in Libya. And so maybe looking at some of the specifics, including the national dialogue.
As a key ingredient.
Yes, yeah, but there are many. It would be complex.
Okay. Questions? The lady in the front had a question. Wait for the microphone, and then the lady behind her. Then we'll come.
Abir Alouj, American University. Just American University in DC.
Not in Cairo.
Not Cairo, because I saw a smile. So just a quick question about, we have been talking about this possibility of having new emerging candidates for the presidential elections. Do you see by all means or any means any Islamist coming back to power?
To the presidency?
Yep.
Question behind, lady behind her. Third row.
Umayma bin Abdullah, Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. My question is to Mr. Ambassador. You have talked about the criticism of international community to Tunisia and not giving it enough credit, given the fact that it's facing a lot of challenges at the same time. My question is about the socio-economic rights. Do you think that the current government did not had problems prioritizing socio-economic rights given the current situation?
Thank you. A gentleman, the two gentlemen there. I'll start with you.
It's going to be a 2-for-1 question.
2-for-1.
Munjid Awadi from the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. But actually, I'm going to frame my comment as a question. As a Tunisian, I cannot be more proud about this whole process of the decentralization and especially the local elections. And Paul, you started with some extremely impressive numbers, and I think Tunisia kind of lacks that PR power, because we know in other parts of the world when somebody allowed women to drive, they became the reformist of the whole region. And so, but what Tunisia is doing is extremely powerful, and I think it started with a wish list in the constitution, and then it translated into the electoral laws and regulations that mandated that not only we're going to have a parity in vertical, but also in these local elections it's going to be horizontal, and that's why we see this increase in number in candidates in women. Also, it mandated a certain percentage of youth that has to be on those lists, and that's why we see this, again, with the enthusiasm of the youth, but also it was intentional. There is the law that said you cannot put a list forward unless you have certain percentage of youth. Also, there has to be certain percentage of the special needs people that has to exist, and so those are intentional laws that started again with a wish list. And it translated into this enthusiasm that people felt empowered, that the law actually forces these political parties. Also, and not just about an Islamist party or anything, but just as a political entities in Tunisia, they opened their lists because they knew that there is a frustration, so they opened their lists to these independents to run. I mean, all these are extremely powerful messages that I think Tunisia needs to talk about more. And I kind of didn't feel that excitement on this panel for some reason. I didn't see a lot of highlights from some, especially those,
You said you were going to turn it into a question.
Maybe I didn't have enough coffee.
Can you have more enthusiasm?
Exactly.
Okay.
So, I'll go to Amir. Maybe he has one.
Maybe. Okay, thank you.
I have Amir Sfaxi from the American University. I have two questions for Elie. The first question is about radicalism, which struck me, your definition of radicalism. Did you see anyone excluding anyone in Tunisia in the election process, or is it from speeches? Because if this case, do you think that the US has a lot of radical elements in its politics as well? There's a lot of people that want to exclude other people from the... So if you say that Tunisia is a radical country for speeches, the US could be a radical country as well. The second question is... No, I don't want to exclude anyone. The second question is about the work that USIP is doing with the police forces and the security forces in Tunisia. Can you tell us more about how it's going on? What are what do you see because the police was a major element in the revolution, and the youth were always angry against the police in Tunisia, and it's still the case in so many regions. There's a lot of frustration and violence between them. Could you tell us more about the work of USIP and how things are going, and where do you see this kind of like rehabilitation of the police with the youth?
Thank you. Amir, take a question, the gentleman in the fifth row.
Jason Pack, Executive Director, U.S. Libya Business Association. I thought there was a lot of enthusiasm on the panel, and I thank the ambassador for his time and perspectives. I just got back from Tunis 2 days ago, and sticking with the theme of enthusiasm, I didn't see much enthusiasm for the local elections. Not many billboards, not much political talk. I made sure to ride like 30 cabs in 1 week, and I chatted about it. People were always listening to radio, and frequently political talk radio, but then didn't have anything to say about who they were going to vote for or when I interrogated them. So my question is about the big picture economic decentralization issue. I don't think that the question of the Sahel versus the interior was referenced much in this panel. And for me, that's the big question about localities. We know that it's a French modeled system. We know power flows centrally down, as does money. But what are the issues in the interior about how to bring those communities up to the pretty high standard of living that people in Tunis have and the high education levels that they have? I wasn't there long enough really to pick up the debate, so I'd love to hear your views on what the real local issues are rather than just the process. Thank you.
Thank you. And the last question from the gentleman right in front of you, yes. Microphone right there. There you go.
My name's Andrew Tuxzexley. I'm from American University. Thank you so much for speaking. I actually have two really quick questions. One of them is an emerging worry on many circles in DC and around the country about the return of radical jihadists into Tunisia after the STEM has turned on many of the fronts against them in other countries such as Syria. So how does Tunisia plan on maybe reintegrating them into their society? And another question is the idea of karama or dignity is a very prevalent theory in much of the Middle East. And how would you say, this is actually addressed towards anyone in the panel, but how would people in Tunisia see the idea of dignity in their country, and do they see this as something that they have access to? And if not, is that something we should be worried about?
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Sabina, do you want to take any of these issue of the Sahel, the interior, or dignity before I would move on to our other panelists?
Well, I can try to offer a little bit, but I think the other panelists have been on the ground a lot more recently than I have. My guess is that the economic decentralization, what happens with that has a lot to do with the code on local authorities that is yet to be adopted. So the details of that, I guess, would influence that question. And in terms of reclaiming dignity or how Tunisians see dignity, I was sort of thinking about these elections and thinking that that's probably the ultimate goal, is to realize that initial call that brought about this whole process. So yeah, I guess it would depend on over time how much people feel like they have a say in things, and that economic development is reaching them, of course.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Elie, and then we'll end with the ambassador.
Thank you. Amir, thank you for your questions. There are definitely radical elements in the U.S. I don't think anyone can, but not only in the U.S., but everywhere. What I was highlighting is the space that they have in our region, but also the scope of the problem in the region. So I never denied that there are radical elements in the West, in the US, and other places. But again, it's about the scope and the space they have. And I would never mention or caution the statement that Tunisia is a radical country. I never said this. I would never say it. There are radical elements in Tunisia. They have a space that I don't think they should have politically, talking of the political space. And they belong to both Islamist and non-Islamist movements. This is, and if you want my opinion in a nutshell, this would be my opinion. The way I say it sometimes is that because there is an assumption that radicals are always Islamist. And as a non-Muslim coming from the country, I can say it with confidence without being accused of being Muslim Brotherhood. As a Christian from Lebanon, no one can say that I'm a Muslim Brotherhood or ISIS member or whatever. So I can say it objectively as someone who comes from the region that there are non-Islamist radicals who are as toxic to our political life as radical Islamists can be. This is, now, if I've seen this in Tunisia, yes, and I've interacted with them. There are radical elements who are within political parties. I've interacted and discussed and debated politics, Tunisian politics, with people who are very close to the government, who belong to Nida Tunis, people who belong to Islamist parties, who would directly put, and including, for example, leaders of student unions, who would put on the table the idea that the other student union doesn't have the right to exist from the very beginning. So this is what I'm calling a radical discourse or radicalization of the politics. When a leader of a student union comes to a dialogue session and tells you the other student union doesn't have the right to exist from the very beginning. And I see this as and I've seen it from secular people as well. I've seen the same attitude from some secular elements. So this is what I was pinpointing to. Going back to the security forces, I think I know where you want to get me to. Yes, we do work with the security forces. We have a program that we're very proud of that consists of reforming the curriculum of the Tunisian Police Academy and the National Guard Academy. We highly value the cooperation of both academies and the Tunisian government in general, the Ministry of Interior. I think given the context in Tunisia, they've made a lot of efforts to meet the requirements of this program. And given the limited resources. Two things to highlight on this issue. The first one is that our project is just one piece of a much broader international effort, including US, EU, and other countries, to reform the security institutions in Tunisia. So, and therefore, it's very hard for us alone to claim any success. We think that the overall effort is successful. It may be a bit slower than expected, but we can definitely see major progress being obvious to the people interacting with the security forces and to the leadership of the security forces themselves. But attributing this to us or any other single agency, I think, is unfair. There is a broader effort. The US is contributing significantly to this effort. There are other also contributions. The question is whether this effort will exclude the possibility of violations by the security forces. I think this is unrealistic. Yes, there are some violations happening. And they have been reported, they have been documented by media, by other human rights organizations. But whether there is a pattern and there is a political decision to continue with this path, I would put a question mark. I think there are elements within the executive branch in Tunisia who are genuine about their desire to curb down these violations. They're not successful in all their attempts, but I can clearly see this will within the key decision makers in Tunisia, at least to minimize these violations.
Thank you, Elie. Mr. Ambassador, the final words are yours.
Thank you. How much time do we have? 5 minutes?
Yeah, 5 minutes.
Because there are a few questions, interesting
feel
questions.
free.
I would like to make sure that I understood the question very well. You said, are there Islamists?
No, I'm not asking about Islamists.
No, about the lady. You said any
question.
force to counter.
The first question was
to counter power.
Someone from the Islamist party.
Islamist party.
To be president.
To become president.
Okay. So I understood well. Yes. Maybe it's too early to answer this question because there is no clear announcement from the Nahda or any other party regarding the presidential election. For sure, the they will contest the legislative. It's obvious, but as far as the presidential elections are concerned, I have no clue. I have no idea. Maybe during the next few months, you will have the answer. Not from me.
Quick comment. I've realized that they're really doing it differently this time because there is a Jewish candidate who got, like, who won, and he's part of the party now, and he's a member of the party. So they are like presenting themselves now as more. Like,
he's on the list for the.
He's on the list.
He's on the list.
In facts, yes.
It's
okay.
Like one of the
it's okay.
representatives. So so it's this new way of thinking.
I'm not going to as diplomat, I'm not going to evaluate any party. I'm keeping the same distance from all political parties. That's my job, and I have to respect, all political parties for their projects and activities. But this is a very good signal, of openness, not only of the party, but of the country as a whole. It's kind of. It tells how much Tunisia is tolerant, and talking about Jewish, they are there, and they come every year. Yeah, they are everywhere in the country, and they come for Al-Ghriba pilgrimage, by thousands. And when I was Vice Minister of Foreign Affairs, like 4 years ago, I went and I celebrate with the Jewish community the pilgrimage in Al-Ghriba. So it's not gharib, it's strange. It's not strange for Tunisians to be tolerant or to be open, and it's a good example. And Nada, this time, is giving the exact and right example of its openness and tolerance, etc. So as far as criticism to the international community, I'm not criticizing anybody. Every country, but I told that politically Tunisia received a big support from the international community. When it comes to direct support and financial support, financial and economic support, that's the question. This is my own opinion. The international community could do more and better for Tunisia, because if you want Tunisia to succeed, we should do something for Tunisia to succeed. Given the challenges, given the problems internally and externally, as I said, some of our problems are not related to us, to Tunisia, but they are important problems. Thank you, Mujidawadi, for your comments. I have no comments. Enthusiasm for the elections. Elections in Tunisia are different from elections here in the US. Your campaigns go for months, for years.
They don't end.
So in Tunisia, no. In Tunisia, the electoral law give precision and date and time and hour for the beginning and the end of the campaign. It should start, let's say, on April 13 at midnight and finish at May 2nd at midnight. And we have like 24 hours, we call it le repos électoral, for people to breathe and relax a little bit. And then we proceed. So if you don't see any signs, any external, that means that the campaign didn't start yet, by law. So come back to Tunisia, like during the electoral campaign process, and you will see thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, of signs of banderoles and etc. And TVs and radio stations and newspapers will be working solely and only on that issue. They are waiting, enthusiastically for this event, because it gives them a lot of material to work, and it will be, as I said,
a lot of money.
A lot of money too. And as I said, it's a very healthy debate, and we are all eager to listen to people talking about their projects and their ideas and their perspectives for the future, for the youth. It's important. And thank you, Monji, once again for giving, the spirit of the law itself. So it encouraged, but not encouraged also, but it obliged the participant and the lists to be figured out according to some prerequisites. It should be a parity, horizontal and vertical parity for men and women participation, special needed people, etc. So it's a lot of conditions. Sometimes it's not only me who look at this process as very, very tight, very complicated in sometimes, but it was done on purpose, a little bit strict and complicated to encourage youth to participate, special people in special need to participate, women to participate, etc., etc. So it is for good purpose. Sahel and interior. These are one of the reasons of the revolution. The regional imbalance, and it's not a debate at all, but the government and even the constitution talked about the regional balance. We are putting together now what we call positive discrimination. Sorry, I hit the mic earlier, so I give it. It's die now. So is dead. Positive discrimination. What does it mean? It means we favor the less developed regions in the country in a positive manner, in a positive way, to reach the same level maybe in the future of development of much more developed regions. So talking about a regional imbalance is one of the priorities of this government, and I think for the next governments, because it's one of the reasons, as I said, of the unhappiness and unsatisfaction of many Tunisians. The return of radicals, there is a whole strategy made by the government in consultation with the civil society and international organization, and this strategy is aiming at reintegrating and rehabilitating those who've been in the war and crisis areas, but for those who are implicated and who participated in terrorist activities, they are persecuted first, and they are tried, and then if there is way to rehabilitate these people, of course, there is room for rehabilitation and de-radicalization and reintegration. Someone here talked about dignity. So the revolution was all about freedom and dignity. Freedom is very well known. Tunisians were asking for freedom, and now I suppose that freedom exists in Tunisia. Freedom of speech, freedom of culture, conscience, and so on and so forth. But how about dignity? How can you preserve people's dignity? It's kind of a very important question, because people, when they ask for their dignity, they think, and I'm one among many Tunisians that think that at a certain level, at a certain time, our dignity was not respected. Now each and every Tunisian is enjoying, dignity, and is proud to be Tunisian. maybe the country is facing, as I said during my intervention, that there are so many difficulties, so many challenges, but when it comes to asking people about how do they feel and how do they expect and how do they feel about their own dignity, I think every Tunisian now is proud with what's going on in the country, despite the difficulties.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I think there was a lot of enthusiasm in the panel. There's certainly a lot of enthusiasm in the hall, and MEI is thrilled to have hosted this this debate. Ambassador Gouia, thank you for being with us today. Elie Abouaoun,
can I make a final comment, please?
And Sabina Henneberg, final comment. Go
Final,
ahead.
Very, it's a consistent message that I try to convey all the time about Tunisia. I think that Tunisia deserves support not because it should be a spoiled child in the international community, but just because the opportunity cost of Tunisia's failure is going to be too high for the region. So it is important for the regional peace and security framework that Tunisia succeeds. And this message is more genuine because it comes from a non-Tunisian, so there are no emotions involved. It's an objective assessment of how much it is going to cost the region if Tunisia's experience fails.
We hope that it succeeds. Thank you all for joining us, and join me in thanking the